If you were told that there was a woman who was mumbling in a strange language, mixing leaves and water, and saying it could cure diseases, what would you think? Miracle? Or witchcraft? The problem isn't her. The problem is how society chooses to define it. For over 4,000 years, humans have been searching for an explanation for things they cannot understand. Drought, disease, sudden death, all require an invisible culprit. And so, the witch was born, not as a strange creature in a fairy tale, but a very real person, usually a woman, sometimes just because living differently from the norm. The ancient Babylonian code of Hammurabi, written in the 18th century BC, stated that if a person was accused of using magic to harm another person, they could be executed unless they could prove their innocence by jumping into a river and emerging safely. Sound familiar? Yes, it was the ancestor of the if she drowns, she's innocent. If she survives, she's a witch test, which medieval Europe adopted thousands of years later. But why is a society so willing to believe in such nonsense? Because fear always needs a form. And nothing is more convenient than a woman who is alone, lives differently, or has knowledge of folk medicine. From ancient Egypt to Greece, from Mesopotamia to Rome, magic has always been a part of religion, of ritual, of daily life. The problem only arises when someone loses the power struggle. Did you know? The first people to be called witches were not called witches because they did bad things. They were accused because they knew too much. They knew how to cure diseases with herbs. They knew how to help a person give birth safely. They knew how to read the moon and stars to predict the weather. They knew things that men in the power structure had no control over. It's easy for modern thinking to laugh at ancient superstitions. But let's stop and ask ourselves, have we really moved past them? Today, if a woman says she senses negative energy from someone, what would you call her? Superstitious, narcissistic, or, in modern parlance, witch? History does not create witches. Society creates them. Then society hunts them. You may have thought of a witch as a symbol of evil. But think again. She was probably just trying to bring a fever down, just whispering a prayer, just living differently than you. The question is not, are witches real? But rather, have we ever, or still do, call someone a witch just because they're not like us? History will never forgive the Black Death. But what it dares not look at is how humans treated each other in the midst of the panic. In 1347, in just a few years, a third of Europe's population disappeared. There was no warning, no cure. No one knew what was happening. The dead piled up like garbage in the streets, and prayers rang out in churches without response. In the most desperate moments, people stopped asking, "Why is God silent?" and began asking who was making God angry. And so, the witch appeared again, not because they caused the plague, but because they were the only ones who could not protect themselves. A woman living alone, a widow with no relatives, a herbalist in the market. They suddenly became the plague, simply because society needed an answer. Any answer was better than God's silence. Faith, when coupled with panic, becomes a torch that burns both man and reason. Priests, instead of seeking salvation, start to threaten. Small towns set up witch hunts. No evidence, no logic. Just an accusation is enough. A child says that the neighbor turns into a black cat in the night. She might be burned alive in the morning. Cruelty does not come from malice, but from faith. A blind faith that if you kill enough bad people, God will forgive you. Here's the scary truth. Witch hunts don't happen when people are most powerful, but when they're most afraid. Plague, war, famine. Whenever social order is shaken, someone has to be thrown into the fire to calm the crowd. And that person is usually the weakest. A woman, an old person, a mentally ill person, a childless person, a recluse, or simply someone who doesn't believe in the community's religion. They were taken away without trial, tortured with hot tongs, shaved for demonic marks, forced to confess to things they had not done, just to avoid a more painful death. Does anything sound familiar? A disease outbreak, a community collapses. People don't blame the healthcare system. They don't blame the government. They blame an individual, different, weak, easily intimidated. This doesn't just happen in medieval Europe. It happens everywhere, in every era, While the entire continent is dying from bacteria, humans spend their time burning each other alive because of the darkness in their imagination. They call it cleansing, but essentially, it is a surrender of reason. Death comes from disease, but barbarism comes from fear. And the scariest thing is that we are not yet sure we have overcome it. There are deaths that not only kill a person, but also kill the conscience of an era. And the death of Joan of Arc is one of them. She was just a 17-year-old peasant girl, illiterate and uneducated, living in a small village called Domremy. But she made a huge claim that she was sent by angels and gods to save France from the English. She did not speak like a scholar. She did not act like a warrior, but her every word shook the nation. Joan was no witch, but she was the perfect example of what society was waiting to destroy, because she dared to hear what others would not, to do what women would not, and to believe in a power that did not belong to men or the church. The girl led the army, fought on the battlefield, retook Orleans, and changed the course of the 100 Years' War. But victory did not save her from the judgment of men. When she was captured by the Burgundians, England's allies, she was handed over to the Inquisition, not for murder, but for hearing voices from heaven, for wearing men's armor, for refusing to submit to the control of the church. And so, she became a witch. No proof needed, no blue fire or dark rituals, just the testimony that she had a supernatural connection. That was enough. Joan's trial was a political drama disguised as religion. 70 questions were thrown at her. She answered every question without fail. They tried to trap her, to force her to contradict herself, but she remained calm, a wisdom that terrified her accusers. Finally, they resorted to the ultimate weapon, fire. Joan was burned at the stake on May 30th, 1431 in Rouen. She was only 19 years old, but her death did not burn her spirit. 25 years later, the papal court reopened the case. They admitted it was a miscarriage of justice. Nearly 500 years later, in 1920, Joan was canonized by Pope Benedict XV. From witch to saint, from heretic to national icon. So what is the truth? The truth is, society can burn anyone if that person is ahead of the times. And when the times catch up with them, society lights candles, erects statues, and calls them heroes. Do you see the irony? Joan didn't die because of the devil. She died because of people who refused to believe that God could talk to a peasant girl. She was not condemned for being a witch. She was condemned for not being a man. And that is the greatest tragedy. Not everyone is burned for doing wrong. Some are burned just for daring to believe in themselves. Once power begins to define morality, justice becomes a noose. And during the European witch hunts, the authorities did not just stand by and watch. They were the hands that tightened the noose. Consider the laws that were enacted not to protect, but to eradicate. In 1542, King Henry VIII of England enacted the first Witchcraft Act, officially making harmful magic a crime punishable by death. The problem was what harmful meant was never clear. A dead cow, a sick child, a person stumbling in the marketplace could all be evidence of a witch's guilt. And so, European governments began a campaign to legalize the panic. Each country had its own version of witchcraft laws. In Scotland, under James VI, who would later become James I of England, hundreds were executed after mass trials, where the testimony of a superstitious person could be life or death. The scariest thing? James VI didn't just make laws. He wrote a book explaining how to spot witches. The title was Demonology, published in 1597. It became a guide for judges throughout Europe. In the eyes of the government, the hunt was not a superstition. It was a duty. And like all political duties, it required efficiency. So instead of investigation, they used torture. Torture until the victim confessed to a pact with Satan, to a witch's mark on his body, to midnight meetings. And then, the confession was recorded as a triumph. Imagine this. You are a widow, dragged from your bed in the middle of the night. They strip you naked, shave your hair, examine every birthmark and scar, looking for the so-called mark of the devil, which, ironically, almost everyone has. They tie you up. They poke you with iron needles until you can no longer feel. Then they declare, you don't feel pain. It proves that the devil protects you. and then you are guilty. The only argument here is no one is innocent when the law is written to convict. Worse still, those who resisted the process, those who questioned its legitimacy, were also suspected of being witches. In a society where fear was institutionalized, silence became the only survival strategy. Torture does more than just cause physical pain. It teaches communities to betray each other. Children denounce their mothers. Neighbors denounce their neighbors. Children are forced to lie so that their parents will not be suspected. Trust is broken. Family ties are fractured. And it's all done in the name of the law. But let me ask, what law deserves respect when it turns a birthmark into a death sentence? The law, it was supposed to be a bulwark against the abuse of power. But in the witch hunt frenzy, it became a weapon. Not against evil, but against anyone who dared to live outside the reach of power. Do you think you live in more civilized times? Remember, every time the government turns fear into law, we take another step toward the black hole of history. Salem is not Europe. There are no stone castles, no ancient churches, no thrones. But there's one thing here that is very much like the old world: fear. In 1692, the town of Salem, Massachusetts, was just a tiny community nestled in the woods. But in a few short months, it became the scene of one of the most notorious witch hunts in American history. Not because of the number of people who died, but because of how a society built on the ideal of freedom chose to kill its first conscience. It all started with young girls. They gathered at night, playing divination and necromancy, a forbidden pastime under the strict Puritan morals. When one of them began to twitch, scream, and shake as if possessed, they were not punished. Instead, they were believed, and from then on, their every quiver became an accusation. She is a witch. So one man was arrested, then two, then 19 were hanged. One man was crushed to death under a boulder because he refused to confess. More than 200 were charged. In a community of only a few thousand people, it was a bloodless massacre. The scariest thing was not the torture. It was the collective belief that it was right, that if a child pointed and screamed, adults should believe it more than their own reason. Learned judges, pious pastors, and even friendly neighbors began to believe in the untruth. For when fear is the instrument of control, reason becomes a rebel. Whoever doubts the accusation is considered a defender of witches. Whoever remains silent is suspected. Whoever confesses is acquitted but must expose others. Such a society does not need demons, because it creates its own demons out of blind faith. The sad thing is, America was then proclaiming itself the land of the free, a place where people had escaped the religious persecution of Europe. But here they were repeating the horrors of the old world. The difference was the gallows had been replaced by a fire, and power wore morality instead of armor. In the end, when it was all over, the courts realized their mistakes. Some were exonerated. Some families received compensation. But what honor can be restored with gold? What death can be erased with an apology? Those who survived lived in shame, forever suspected by society, and Salem forever became a name tainted with darkness. We often look back and say, things are different now. But the question is not, do we still have witch hunts? But rather, what do we believe today that 300 years from now, our descendants will have to bow their heads in apology? In 1782, when Europe had entered the Enlightenment, when people began to believe in reason, science, and human rights, a woman was still executed for witchcraft. Her name was Anna Goldie, and she was the last person to be executed for that crime on the European continent. Anna was not a mysterious person living in the deep woods. She was a servant, an ordinary Swiss woman, working for a noble family in Glarus. Her life consisted of cleaning, cooking, serving. But one day, the daughter of the house owner fell strangely ill. She said there were needles in her food, that her limbs were bending uncontrollably, and the accusation was uttered. No proof needed, no medical examination needed, no excuses from Anna, because in that society, the poor were always the most vulnerable to blame. And in the eyes of the powerful, Anna's presence was a threat, not because she had supernatural powers, but because she knew too much. There were rumors that she had had an affair with the landlord. There were whispers that the girl was sick from something else, something the rich didn't want to make public. And Anna was a pawn who could be easily disposed of to silence them all. She was initially sentenced to death. But since it was the Enlightenment, where reason and human rights were flourishing, the government was hesitant. They didn't want to be seen as backward, so they changed the sentence. She was executed not for witchcraft, but for child poisoning. A more palatable charge, a more palatable excuse. But the essence remains the same. A woman killed to protect the honor of the strong. Anna was beheaded. No one came to her rescue. No one dared to defend her. Because in a system where the law does not protect the weak, any resistance is futile. And then time passed. In 2008, more than 2 centuries later, Switzerland officially declared the Anna Goldie case a judicial miscarriage of justice. She was exonerated. A small museum was erected in her memory. But let me ask you, when it takes people more than 200 years to realize that they killed the wrong person, is that society truly civilized? Anna's death is not the end of an era. It is proof that barbarism can be legal, as long as it is carried out in the right way. And if the law can be used to legitimize a crime, who will uphold justice? We often believe that witches are products of darkness. But sometimes, darkness is what is written in black ink, stamped with red seals, and signed by people in authority. Anna Goldie was not the only victim. She was just the last bell tolled before superstition was covered by the mask of civilization. But if we do not remember her, history is ready to repeat itself. Just change the names of the victims and renew the reasons. We like to think that witches are gone, that humanity, after centuries of learning, has grown wiser, more rational, and no longer believes in superstitions. But the truth is different. Witches never died. Only their physical form has changed, and the way we treat them remains as cruel as ever. Did you know that in 2008, in Papua New Guinea, a woman was stripped naked, tied to a stake, and burned alive because the villagers believed she had used senyuma, or witchcraft, to kill a child? There was no evidence, no investigation. All it took was one person to point a finger, and the fire would flare up again, as if it were 15th century Europe, Nigeria, Congo, India, even rural Mexico. There are places where just an accusation of witchcraft is enough to get someone publicly executed. Old women, the mentally ill, the poor, those who live differently, can all become 21st century witches. And the bitter thing is, the modern world no longer uses laws to protect them, but instead uses silence to conceal crimes. In the Congo, there are children who are thrown out of their homes because the local pastor declared them witches. There are 6- and 7-year-olds, homeless, beaten, starved, simply because they have nightmares or are sick, or simply because they have unusual eyes. In India, between 2000 and 2020, more than 2,000 people, mostly women, were killed on suspicion of witchcraft. Some are buried alive. Some were beheaded. Some were raped before being executed. And all of this took place in communities that were not isolated from the world, but chose to live in fear rather than face the truth. We thought technology would save us from superstition. Instead, it has become a vehicle for spreading accusations faster than ever. A rumor spread on WhatsApp, an edited video on social media. It can spark a real-life hunt. Fear, once shared, multiplies exponentially. And you know what's most heartbreaking? Even people who believe in human rights, gender equality, progressive education, can still look away, ignore it, or dismiss it as a local cultural issue. But since when did culture become an excuse to condone torture and murder? The modern, which doesn't have a pointy nose, doesn't ride a broomstick, doesn't cast spells. She might be a single mother, an autistic child, a woman who dares to say no, a person who believes differently. And in a world where being different is still seen as a threat, she's still a target. We don't have to wait until the 17th century to see a burning. We just have to open our eyes to look into the dark places that the modern world doesn't want to talk about. Because witches don't go away. We just find new ways to call them out, and new ways to punish them, with fire, with knives, with indifference. The 21st century has arrived. But if faith still leads to evil, then the Middle Ages are not far away. They are here, right now. We burn them alive. We hanged them in the square. We made fun of them at carnivals. And then, We started selling tickets to the very place where the executions used to be. What's wrong with that? Not necessarily. But let's be honest. How do we remember witches? As symbols of evil? As fantasy figures? Or as real people who were betrayed by the world? Visit Salem today, once a dark spot in American history. You'll see shops selling glowing witch hats, tours of the witch room, and black-robed employees holding brooms, taking selfies with tourists. On Halloween, the place is so packed that there's barely room to stand. But how many of them stop at the memorial to read the names of those hanged for a false accusation? Witches, from a scary image to a brand. Hollywood turns them into powerful, seductive, or downright evil characters. Movies like The Witch, Hocus Pocus, The Craft, Harry Potter, creating an entire industry of fantasy. That's true. But when entertainment is piled on top of pain, when fantasy overshadows reality, we begin to forget that real people were burned at the stake. Not because they had magic, but because they had no power. In Scotland, France, Germany, Switzerland, hundreds of witchcraft execution sites have become tourist attractions. Some are museums. Some host torture shows. Tourists pose for pictures next to gallows as if they were movie props. But for the descendants of the murdered, for the women who still bear the surname Goldie, or Proctor, or Nurse, it's not a legacy. It's a wound. The problem is not remembering. It's how we remember. If you make pain your destination, at least leave the truth. Don't tell them they were real witches. Tell them that society treated them as witches, and that was wrong. If you stage a trial in a theater, let the final words be, "We were wrong." If you sell notebooks with notes of love potions, remember that someone was burned at the stake for having one. Remembering is not about beautifying the past. It is about making sure it never happens again. Witchcraft, as we used to call them, has been a moral litmus test for centuries. And to this day, not every society passes that test. There are still places that kill for superstition. There are still people who use religion to oppress. There are still communities that choose to trust fear over reason. History is not dead. It lives on in how we tell it, in how we choose who is the victim, who is the perpetrator, who is remembered, and who is forgotten. And if tomorrow there is another woman standing up, saying things that others don't want to hear, living differently, stepping out of the mainstream, what will we call her? Hero or wizard?